Welcome to Planet Lex, the podcast of Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, bringing it to you from Chicago, Illinois.
Hello, and welcome to Northwestern Pritzker School of Law's Planet Lex. I'm your host, Interim Dean Jim Speta. Joining me today is Michael Kang, the William G. and Virginia K. Karnes Professor of Law here at Northwestern. Michael is a nationally recognized expert on election law, campaign finance, voting rights, redistricting judicial elections, and also corporate governance. His research has been published widely in leading law journals and also featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Forbes, and many other places. His recent work focuses on partisan gerrymandering, the influence of party and campaign finance on elected judges, the deregulation of campaign finance after the Citizens United decision, and so-called sore loser laws that restrict losing primary candidates from running in the general election. Michael was last a guest on the podcast in the weeks before the 2018 midterm elections. Indeed, Michael was my first guest as I took over the podcast from former Dean Dan Rodriguez. We're lucky to have him back today to discuss the various legal issues swirling around the upcoming presidential election. Michael, thanks so much for joining today.
Great to be here, Jim. Thanks for having me again.
We're recording this episode on October 19th, just a few weeks before the 2020 election. And of course, we're still in the middle of a global pandemic. There is, even as we speak, a large amount of election-related litigation, largely around how votes will be cast and tallied in key states amid this health crisis. Just yesterday, the New York Times reported that there were 350 cases pending in state and federal courts involving some aspect of voting. Is it accurate to say that this is a significant increase in the number of cases going into an election, or is this what we usually see?
This is definitely a year with more litigation than usual. I don't know what the numbers were in 2016, but I think this year you have what you might say is a kind of perfect storm for pre-election litigation. And I think what we've seen so far is really just a hint of what potentially might come after the election. So yeah, definitely more litigation this year.
So what's contributing to that perfect storm? Why are we seeing so much litigation now?
Yeah, a bunch of things are converging to make this a really litigious year. I mean, I think one thing is that we've seen this steady rise in election disputes and litigation over election rules since Bush versus Gore, and that's kind of dovetailed with increases in partisanship and partisan polarization, where we see a lot of tight races and more sort of constitutional or election hardball where both sides are pushing things to the limit to try to gain as much advantage as they can from the rules. So you already had that going on, but this year you have COVID, which is causing a shakeup in all the rules. And whenever you have a shakeup or a potential change to the rules, there's going to be fights over what those changes are going to look like, whether certain changes or whether others are going to stick. And how the different jurisdictions are going to deal with COVID. And then on top of that, we've got a president this year, President Trump, who seems particularly interested in the election rules and convinced that they're rigged against him and the Republicans. And so I think that's brought a lot more attention to this. Both sides have really well-funded litigation teams where they're making sure that they're not caught out by the rules and making sure that all the changes serve their interests as much as they can get them to.
You say the changing rules brought on by COVID. I take it one of the things is increased, at least interest in voting by mail due to the pandemic. What other rules have been changing due to COVID?
Well, I think there are certainly changes to in-person voting that are going to make voting more complicated this year. At least in the primary season, it was hard to get poll workers to even show up. In places like Milwaukee, you saw this dramatic reduction where essentially in the city of Milwaukee, I think they shut down about 95% of the polling places that usually are available because they couldn't get workers to staff the in-person places. And obviously with COVID, there's going to be changes to the way that in-person voting works in terms of cleaning polling stations, in terms of spacing out voters, and all that's going to slow down the process. But obviously, probably the biggest change this year is a shift to voting by mail. And that's really the large shift where people are really litigating how that's going to work and who's allowed to vote by mail and how that whole process is run.
I'm interested in the vote by mail cases. There are a couple of different dimensions to it. You mentioned one, which was who gets to vote. In many of the cases, the issue is whether a voter needs a particular reason in order to vote by mail and whether that reason has to be verified. Are there identifiable trends to whether voting by mail is available to everyone, or you have to prove that you have a reason to vote by mail?
There are so many changes to mail voting this year because of COVID that it's really hard to generalize. It really is different from state to state. So, I mean, this year you have a massive expansion in voting by mail. One thing is you had a handful of Western states primarily that did pretty much all of their voting by mail and mail ballots to everybody. Obviously, for those states, they had the least amount of change to deal with. But this year, there's a number of states that joined them in sending out mail ballots to everybody. There's an even a larger group of states, including Illinois, that decided to send mail ballot applications to everybody. So that by itself is a huge change. But what you're talking about is absentee voting, where voters had to apply to vote absentee. And the question there is whether they had to provide some excuse beyond sensitivity or worry about COVID exposure, or whether there was no excuse absentee voting. So a lot of states that previously to this year required some sort of excuse to receive an absentee ballot have essentially waived those requirements for this year. And that's left really, I think, about 5 states that still require an excuse beyond a fear about COVID exposure to vote absentee. And those states, if you're trying to generalize, those are pretty conservative states controlled by Republicans: Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and I think Indiana.
That is a really, really significant change. But one thing that strikes me is you're saying that there's so much variation state to state. We're going into an election on which most of the focus is on the presidential election and federal offices. Why is this all happening at the state level?
Well, the American election system is highly decentralized. So almost everything is really decided at the state and local level. So it's not surprising that you're going to have a lot of variation in how they deal with COVID, how they deal with this election, because it's always like that. So even in the normal year, there's a huge amount of variation in terms of methods of voting, who gets to vote how. All of those process questions are really basically decided at the state level. So the litigation is also being handled at the state and local level, and still has a ton of variation. And so you see states that are more Republican controlled are a little more restrictive in terms of how they're handling this, and that's no surprise because that's generally the Republican orientation toward voting, whereas Democrats are much more receptive to accommodation of COVID-related relief from the normal requirements from voting, and that's part of the partisan divide on a lot of these issues that drives the litigation.
I want to come back to that partisan divide in just a minute, but before we move off of mail-in voting, there are a couple of other issues that I want to get your reaction to. Some of the cases have been focusing on the method of collecting the ballots, whether through drop boxes or otherwise. And in a number of states, Texas, Ohio, California, there have been really significant disputes about the placement of drop boxes, how many we're going to have, whether the parties can put their own drop boxes down. Why is this an issue? Why isn't it just good to collect as many ballots as possible?
Well, I think that is the position of a lot of people, and a lot of people who think seriously about election issues, is that we should try to make voting by voters that are eligible to vote and entitled to vote as easy as possible. And I think in a nutshell, that is how Democrats would characterize their position. I think the Republican position is that when you make voting too easy or too accessible, that it potentially opens the door to election fraud. And so a lot of Republican resistance this year to freeing up ballot access, making it easier to vote, especially under COVID conditions, have been justified in the name of election integrity or preventing voter fraud of some sort. I think the Dropbox issue is not one that we've really thought very much about before this year, and it's really because we have this big shift to mail voting. And there's a lot of worries about how well the Postal Service will handle the delivery and the return of these ballots. So I think it gives some voters some peace of mind that they can physically drop off their ballots somewhere. It's usually the practice with absentee voting that you can physically drop off your ballot at the polling place. But there's an attempt right now in places like Texas where you have really large counties to increase the number of drop boxes. To be honest with you, it's hard for me to understand why there's so much resistance to the drop box issue, especially where there are certain guarantees where there's observers to make sure that no one's messing with the ballots. But largely, that's what the dispute is between Republicans and Democrats in places like Texas and Ohio, whether you're limited to one drop box or some small number of drop boxes, or whether there can be more. In California, it's a little bit different. California has this really strange circumstance where the Republican Party has set up ballot drop boxes that are labeled official drop boxes, even though they're set up by the Republican Party, and the ballots will be picked up by the Republican Party and not by some governmental entity that's actually processing the vote. So I think that's misleading, and that hasn't been sorted out yet. But that's what's going on with the drop boxes. It's largely because of this big shift to mail voting.
You mentioned the Postal Service just a minute ago, and there are now cases in the U.S. Supreme Court on the question of timing. When do ballots have to be received in order to be counted for the votes? What's happening in those cases?
Well, so I think what's happening a lot, if you're sort of generalizing about those kinds of cases and others that are basically about whether the state's going to loosen up the rules to make it easier to vote, or whether they won't in light of COVID concerns, that's done basically at the state level with lower courts, and the lower courts have been pretty sympathetic to worries about COVID and attempts by the state to loosen up the rules, and to arguments by plaintiffs who want the rules or the normal restrictions loosened up a bit. Where you see more resistance is at the courts of appeals, state Supreme Courts, where it seems to become more partisan, and where Republicans control those courts, you see a lower success rate. So it really varies from state to state. The U.S. Supreme Court sort of dealt with this timing issue during the Wisconsin primary, and what they decided was that the ballots had to be postmarked by Election Day, but were willing to allow the state to receive those postmarked ballots and count those sometime after Election Day, to accommodate the fact that people might actually cast their ballot by mail by Election Day, but the Postal Service takes a little bit of time to actually deliver it to the government. And so it's hard to generalize about that because it's different in different places. There is a huge case that we're waiting for from Pennsylvania that the U.S. Supreme Court is considering, and we're not totally sure what's going to happen with that. That falls along the same lines, that the Pennsylvania courts have extended the deadline for receiving the ballots. I think every state requires the ballots to be postmarked by Election Day, but the real question is whether they have to be received by Election Day or sometime afterward. And the Pennsylvania courts essentially extended that deadline beyond Election Day. And so that there was a request for a stay, and that's still pending as of this recording. It may be resolved by the time this is published, but that's actually a big case for sort of complicated reasons that I can get into if you'd like.
Let me ask this simpler question, which is, if the ballots can be postmarked on Election Day, are we looking at a serious possibility that we might not know on the evening of November 3rd who wins the presidential election, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I talk to students or interested observers, different audiences, the media, one thing I've tried to emphasize, and I think people who are election law experts have tried to emphasize, is that we shouldn't expect necessarily announcement of an election outcome on election night, precisely because a bunch of these ballots are going to be coming in after Election Day, and that the counting of these mail ballots is a little more complicated than the in-person voting. There's a lot more processing that has to go on. So, especially in a close election, we shouldn't necessarily expect an outcome on election night. Now, having said that, there's a few things that might go the other way, where we might be able to know election night, or at least by Wednesday morning, whether we have an outcome. One thing is, if the election's not close, then it might be an easier call, right? So if it looks like Biden is leading by significant margins and the mail voting probably won't change that, then I think there might be a willingness to call the election, because right now the polling suggests that Biden, this is what is today, October 19th, the polling suggests Biden is comfortably ahead. And so if that continues to be the case through Election Day and Biden has comfortable margins in so many states that the mail balloting doesn't really matter, then we might be able to make a call that night. I think if the election is close, the real delay is probably going to come from the Rust Belt states. And so those are Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, where the law, at least at the moment, doesn't allow the election authorities to start processing ballots until Election Day. So if you've got a close outcome that turns on those states, and they haven't been able to process the mail ballots until Election Day, then it'll be hard for them to be able to declare a winner in a close race on Tuesday night. So I think that'll be part of the process of delay. I mean, I think right now the estimates are we should have more than 100 million votes counted by Wednesday morning. The turnout here is going to be pretty heavy, and so
I've seen estimates of 150 million.
Right. So you can think of that two different ways, right? One is we'll have most of the ballots counted. And so if the election is not close, then a call might be possible. But on the other hand, if it's close, you'll still have, let's say, 40 to 50 million votes still to count that might swing it one way or the other. It's hard to know right now whether we'll be able to make a call on election night, but there's a decent chance that we won't.
You've mentioned counting. There seems to be a significant amount of early voting going on, that not vote by mail, but vote in person in many states, early voting. But those votes don't get counted before Election Day, do they?
Right. So the votes aren't counted, but I think the in-person voting, early voting, as opposed to mail voting, is a little less complicated because there's less processing of those votes. So I think the thing with the mail voting that causes some delay is that there's often signature verification, there's a privacy envelope. So all of that processing in certain states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania can't even start occurring until Election Day. Now, most states do actually allow the election authorities to start processing the ballots, not counting the ballots, because there are worries that if you start counting the ballots before Election Day, then you can sort of rig the election in some way, or at least there's that potentiality. But the processing of ballots, so you get them ready for counting, in most states actually can occur before Election Day, but in a few Rust Belt states, that's not allowed. And in particular, those states don't have as much experience and history with absentee voting as, let's say, like Florida or Arizona, where they're a little more confident in those states about being able to process the ballots really quickly. So I think North Carolina, someone, I don't remember if it was the Secretary of State or some election authority, said that they were pretty confident they would be able to make a call that night. So whether that's true or not, I don't know, but North Carolina has a little bit more history with absentee voting than, let's say, Wisconsin. And so I think the expectation is that the Midwestern states might be a little slower. And given that there's kind of two paths to victory here for Biden and Trump, the kind of Rust Belt string of states or the Sun Belt states, Sun Belt states seem a little bit more confident about their ability to process everything and produce a count and maybe call the election by Wednesday morning, whereas the Rust Belt states, I think there's a little less confidence about that.
Although you've also already mentioned litigation that could happen after Election Day. And you've also mentioned that President Trump talks a lot, although there's little evidence of this so far, talks a lot about voter fraud situations. Are we going to see a wave of voter fraud litigation after the election, no matter what happens?
That's an excellent question. So I think there's two different things. One will there be election or voter fraud? And then the second question, which is not necessarily related, is whether we'll have litigation over election fraud or voter fraud. So I think there's not serious reason to think that there's going to be systematic election or voter fraud this election or kind of in general. There's been a lot of claims about voter and election fraud over the years, and certainly this year in particular by President Trump. And there's been many opportunities for people who worry about election fraud to prove their point. And it's really safe to say those have been decisively defeated. A lot of these election cases this year over changing the rules and how to handle COVID have often involved these claims about prevention of election fraud and demanded that people challenging loosening up the rules show some risk of election fraud. And I believe in every case they have failed to do that. I mean, so there's just a lot of skepticism when forced to prove their point about these claims before courts. President Trump set up a presidential commission on election fraud. They essentially were not able to substantiate anything, and that commission disbanded in short order. So I think these claims about voter and election fraud have been debunked, not just by academics, although that's certainly true, but also by courts and by the entire political system. And Ben Ginsburg, probably the most important Republican election lawyer of the last 20 years, had an op-ed, I think, in the Washington Post where he said, there's just no evidence of this, of election fraud, any sort of systematic election fraud. Of course, there's sometimes isolated cases, and that might be true this year, but the idea that there's systematic election or voter fraud that would require turning over the election seems really, really dubious. The question about whether there's going to be litigation based on election fraud, different thing, because it seems like President Trump is fairly insistent about this narrative that Democrats are trying to rig the election or steal the election through election fraud, which is entirely unsubstantiated as far as anyone can tell. But given that he thinks that the 2016 election was rigged and he won that election and he spent 4 years claiming that it was rigged against him, suggests that whatever happens this year, he'll probably make a similar claim. I think that the important question is whether that litigation would be successful. And there's a pretty steep hill to climb to be able to overturn election based on a claim of election fraud. You'd have to be able to substantiate that in court or before the election authorities. And not only show that there was some really serious worry about election fraud that happened in the election, but also that it was significant enough to cause serious doubt about the outcome of that election. So I'm more worried about the kinds of claims that are made about election fraud, because I think regardless of whether there's truth to them, people, when the President of the United States makes a claim, there are a lot of people who are going to believe him, whether there's a real basis for that or not. And that's going to really undermine people's confidence in the election system, not only for this election, but going forward. And I think that's a serious problem.
You mentioned the Bush versus Gore litigation and how that may have emphasized the value of litigation, but the circumstance there was that the election really was on a knife edge of being very close. And so that second piece of how close the election is will drive the litigation, I think, is key to what happens after November 3rd.
Absolutely. So there's something that we often refer to as the election administrator's prayer, which is, please don't let the election be close. Because if the election is close, then we really have to put a spotlight, a microscope on everything that happened in the election. And inevitably there are errors, there's incompetence, there are mistakes, lots of things that happen that suddenly get exposed and could be consequential. As long as the election, and most elections are like this, there's some comfortable margin one way or the other, then there's less pressure on the rules and less pressure on election administrators to get everything right. And I think that's one of the things, obviously, this cycle that's driving all this worry is that people expect the election to be close. Now, the polls right now look like they might not be super close in the presidential race, but obviously there's going to be close races somewhere in the election system. And so people are working really hard to try to get everything done well and make sure that people are able to vote without undue worry about COVID and without worrying about their votes not being counted.
Well, let me ask you in that regard about another thing that we're seeing now is pictures out of a number of places, particularly Georgia, that I've seen of very long lines to engage in early voting. And some are saying that this is evidence of voter suppression, but whether that's true or not, I wonder how much of that is related to something that I know you've done work on, which is the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder, striking down part of the Voting Rights Act. Is there a connection between what we're seeing and what happened in Shelby County?
I think there's a bit of a connection between Shelby County striking down preclearance under the Voting Rights Act and things like long lines in Georgia. As you know, I lived in Georgia for a long time, and voting in Atlanta, at least, has always been a bit of a challenge, even before Shelby County. I waited 5 hours to early vote in 2004.
Wow.
And, that was under preclearance, and it wasn't because of any sort of recent change. So I think we have a larger problem in the United States, not just in Georgia, where there's unequal resources across different jurisdictions. And so some jurisdictions you have long lines, and other places you have hardly any line. And it's not obvious at all. This was part of what Ben Ginsburg and Bob Bauer's commission concluded when they did a huge nationwide review of election administration, was that there's not a kind of sensible system of allocation of resources for election administration. And that's part of what we're seeing when we see these really long lines in certain areas of places like Atlanta. There seem to be fewer resources per capita for areas that happen to be poorer and have racial minority concentrations. And so I think that's part of what we're seeing. I do think, though, that Shelby County is a little bit of the story in places like Georgia, because in Georgia, there's been about a 30% increase in registered voters since around the time of Shelby County, since like 2012, 2013, something like that. But we've actually seen a 10% decline in the number of polling places. And the decline in polling places, so that's partly why you see the lines, because you have more voters, particularly in a year where turnout's probably going to be higher, and you've got fewer polling places, so the lines are going to be longer. And that's especially true in minority communities, not only because of this inefficient allocation of resources, but also because African American voters, for instance, tend to prefer to vote in person as opposed to mail voting. So when you see early voting, that's part of how African Americans are going to vote. They prefer that to voting absentee. So you have all this pressure, especially on the opening day of early voting. I think things have eased up a little bit on the second day and probably going forward. But this decline in polling places would have been harder to pull off under preclearance before Shelby County, because any sort of change like removal or reduction in polling places would have been subject to preclearance requirements where they would have had to show that this did not have a discriminatory effect under the Voting Rights Act. And so what you saw after Shelby County when those restrictions were removed was a pretty dramatic reduction in polling places across what used to be covered jurisdictions. I think that does contribute to waits and pressure on the election system when a lot of these covered jurisdictions, as soon as Shelby County was announced, instituted all kinds of changes. The decline in the number of places to vote is just one of those things, but reduction in early voting in a lot of places, institution of voter ID, a lot of these things make it harder to vote. And so that's it's not surprising to see longer waits and more challenges in voting since Shelby County than before, and especially in this year's election.
Well, let me ask you for your view on this broader question. What changes would you like to see in the election system, both to make it easier to vote and to instill more confidence in the outcome of elections?
Oh, geez, Jim. That's like a pretty broad question.
Okay.
I think one thing that would be good, and I think this is really, kind of it's a reaction a bit to this year's events, is we should have nonpartisan election administration. So in almost every state, the Secretary of State is a partisan elected official. And that's not a good practice, because elections ought to be nonpartisan. They shouldn't be run with the idea of giving one side an advantage. In most other industrialized countries, the election authority is some sort of insulated nonpartisan administration and not an elected partisan official. And here there's just too much incentive for people like the Secretary of State, if it's a Democrat or Republican, to kind of rig the rules a bit in favor of their own side. Now, I don't think that's actually all that common, that the Secretaries of State in the various states are really like actively trying to rig the rules in their side's favor. So I don't think that's a huge problem of conscious bias, but we do have some egregious examples. And I think it's just a bad temptation institutionally to have. So, I mean, I think if you had to choose one thing, it might be that, which is make the Secretary of State an insulated position from partisan politics, or have some sort of appointment process, sort of like Wisconsin is probably the one state that people point to a model where they have an election board, essentially by appointment, that requires consultation, I think, of the state Senate, and it's staffed largely with former judges who sort of do this election oversight. And so I think probably that would be a useful move if you had to pick one thing.
Do you see a likelihood of that happening?
No. I don't see a likelihood of that. I mean, I think first there's a long tradition of secretaries of state being elected and part of the usual process, and I think probably people would be uncomfortable with too much change to that process. I do think probably there's more support for it now than there had been, in part because polarization and partisanship have increased so much that both sides see the problems with that. But I wouldn't expect to see sweeping change in any sort of short order.
Now, the Democrats did pass in the House in 2019 a fairly significant proposal for election reform. It didn't do the nonpartisan state administration that you're talking about. It's not clear the federal government could do that, but it had a number of proposals around gerrymandering, changing ethics rules, changing private money in elections. If the Democrats were to win the Senate and the White House, that legislation might move forward. What are your views of the For the People Act, as it's called?
Yeah, H.R. 1. I think For the People Act was a huge laundry list of kind of every reform proposal you could imagine. And that's not actually too much of an exaggeration. And I think part of the reason it was so expansive was because the Democrats knew it wasn't going to pass. So they could put whatever they want in there, and it was largely for show. That doesn't make it useless. It sort of put the Democrats on the record as supporting a huge number of reforms. But I would imagine if they really did sweep the federal government and controlled the Senate, House, and the presidency, that you'd get a different reform proposal that's probably not quite as expansive. They would have to pare that down because they would have to think seriously about what they really want. So I think one thing that would be interesting among the many different proposals, as you mentioned, ethics reform, voting rights, reinstitution of preclearance, all of these different things. One of the things is whether they really would support a requirement of independent redistricting commissions. Because if you have the Democrats sweep the federal elections and take control of the Senate, that would mean that it was a really good election for the Democrats if that happened. And what that might mean is they control a lot more of the state legislatures than they do now. And this is a really good year to take control of the state legislature because the redistricting cycle will start after the census. And so for the Democrats to impose redistricting commissions on congressional redistricting across the country would mean the Democrats are giving up a huge opportunity to gerrymander and get some partisan advantage out of their newfound control of state government in a lot of different places. And they've spent the last decade hurting from the way that the Republicans were able to take control of a lot of state governments in the 2010 cycle and control gerrymandering over that period. So they'd be giving up a huge opportunity to kind of pay back the Republicans for the last redistricting cycle. So it'd be interesting to see if Democrats really will stick to their guns, stick to the principles that they've articulated, and give up that opportunity for political advantage. I think the other thing that I found interesting at H.R. 1 is there was, I think, a proposal to make the FEC a 5-person commission so that you actually would have potentially a voting majority. So the way the FEC was set up is sometimes described as an institution set up to fail, because you had 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats essentially on the FEC. And so really nothing gets through the FEC unless you've got bipartisan support. And so, it's kind of an incumbent protection scheme, or at least that's one allegation about it. Whereas making it a 5-person commission where you could have a voting majority, especially if the Democrats are in control of it, would really empower the FEC and allowed the FEC to jump into a lot of enforcement questions that for really almost the last 15 years, the FEC has been toothless in dealing with. They haven't even really had a quorum where they could even think about acting. And so if that were to happen and the Democrats were to take a 3-2 majority in the FEC, it would really potentially change the way campaign finance works these days.
Although they'd have to be willing to do so knowing that at some point there might be a 3-2 majority for Republicans when there's a Republican president.
That's true. And that is a kind of institutional and incentives question that hangs over basically everything in national politics these days.
Well, all of this makes me so happy that you're with us here at Northwestern, because I know there will be a lot more for us to talk about in future podcasts. Hopefully not on the morning of November 4th, but I'm sure shortly thereafter, and then as we go forward. That is our show for today. Thank you, Michael, very much for joining me. If all of you out there like what you heard, please subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. Thank you again for listening. I'm Jim Spetta, signing off.
If you'd like more information about today's show, please visit law.northwestern.edu/planetlex or legaltalknetwork.com. Subscribe via iTunes and RSS. Find both Northwestern Pritzker School of Law and Legal Talk Network on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Or download the free app from Legal Talk Network in Google Play and iTunes. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Northwestern University, Legal Talk Network, or their respective officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.